And I'm Aloha and Makamaka, and welcome to the Halal of Poka. This is going to be a grassroots approach to social analysis of what is happening here in Hawaii and the rest of the world. And so let me begin by saying that in this approach, I'm going to take it by the numbers, from 1 to 5. And what I'm going to do is cover principles of social analysis that I have used, and I plan to share it with you. Over a period of time, we'll have public discussions about this, especially when I begin my radio show. And you will be able to get in touch and find out when I will be broadcasting and how to reach my radio programs and engage in conversation during that radio show. So, what I want to do is begin with basic principles. And the first is dealing with the principle of one. And let me explain the principle of one. You know, I've been a practitioner of this civil arts, this cultural arts. Some people also see it as a martial arts. And it's called Tai Chi. Tai Chi, as well as another practice I engage in, which is called Qi Kung, comes from a Taoist philosophy. And so we take from that particular part of the world, out of China, and try to understand what the heck is going on? What is the world all about? The Taoists say that the initial principle number one, is the wholeness of things. And that's the Wu Qi. So at times if you see people practicing their Tai Chi forms or the Qi Kung forms, they might begin with coming up and then coming down to establish that singular principle. Nothing is created, nothing destroyed. Everything in the world is that oneness. And that oneness has changes within it, but it's still part of the oneness. What had happened in that oneness, you then began the division between yin and yang, between hard and soft, between night and day, between male and female, between right and left, between all these principles of opposite, yin-yang principles. So that's the oneness of everything, that even within that you can have your division, but they all come together in one. If you look at what sometimes we call the Tai Chi symbol, you will see within a circle a fish-shaped image that may be black on the top and white at the bottom, or exchanged. But the black fish has a white eye, and the white fish has a black eye. And that is to symbolize that within this oneness you have the idea of Tai Chi, yin and yang, opposites. One is male, one is female. But even within the female, there's aspects of masculinity. And even within the male, there's aspects of femininity. So things are not absolute. They are always in a constant mixture. Sometimes we look at a person and we think, that's a good person. But that person also engages in bad things. It doesn't take away from his goodness, but it shows that he or she is contained of a multitude of different things. You know, when I was a child, I used to read comic books. Those were my favorite subjects to read. And the comic book, one particular strip, comes from Lash LaRue. Many of you younger than me have no clue what I'm talking about. And many of you of my age also have no clue of what I'm talking about. But I remembered one particular statement that came out of this comic book. So this is my comic book philosophy. And what the character says is that however good, or no matter how good a person is, that person always has some badness about him. And no matter how bad a person is, there's always some goodness about him. So the world is not in absolutes. At least that's a Taoist philosophy. That's a philosophy of yin yang. I think it's an important principle that we need to begin to absorb. We need to begin to fully appreciate, to understand this basic concept. Another concept of oneness that I want to share with you is this lesson that this Buddhist priest once came up to me and bumped me on the side while I was at his dojo. This is called Dai Honzan Chozan Ji. Okay? It's a Buddhist temple, the headquarters of this particular sect of Zen Buddhism. And he's a Kalihi boy, and so Roshi Tanui Sensei, or Roshi Tanui, comes up to me and bumps in and he says, "Hey, remember," now he's the Zen instructor, and I just got into a fight with the federal judge, Sam King, who I insist that I'm not a U.S. citizen, I'm a Hawaiian national, and then he tries to take my license away to practice law in his court. So Roshi Tanui tells me, "Hey, remember, the quest is not to walk the straight path, but to learn to walk the crooked path straight." In the Zen practice, you have what is called a koan. These are sort of riddles, such as the famous one, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Well, this is another koan. It forces you to start thinking about, what do you mean? So my response to him was, "Oh sure, I know that." But in the back of my head, I'm asking myself, what in the world does he mean? The quest is not to walk the straight path, but to learn to walk the crooked path straight. Oftentimes when we get involved in various movements, I've been very much involved in the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, trying to bring about the independence of Hawaii. Back when I was in the military service in 1969 to 1973, I served in the U.S. Air Force. I joined and served in the U.S. Air Force. But what happened was that I discovered Liliuokalani's story entitled Hawaii's Story by Hawaii's Queen. And as I read through the events that occurred in Hawaii, and while wearing the uniform of the U.S. military at Hickam Air Force Base, I asked myself, what am I doing in this uniform, in this military base, part of the occupation force of Hawaii? And so I blew up. I got really mad. I decided I'm going out and I'm going to kill all these other occupiers. I'm going to destroy buildings. I'm going to try to break down the American system that operates here in Hawaii. That was my direct path, my straight path, have absolutely nothing to do with the American system. But then I decided that it won't work, it won't make any changes. I will not have educated anyone, brought any truth to anyone, and so I would need to change my pathway. So at that time I decided, no sense doing that, I may as well go back to law school. I had previously attended George Washington University in Washington, D.C. This time I was in the military, I couldn't finish, I got sick, I didn't have enough money. So I came home, I joined the military during the Vietnam period. But then I said, I gotta get back into law school. I gotta get into the system. I have to get my license. And once I'm inside the system, then I can begin to explode the system, not from outside, but from inside. And the weapons that I would use is history. The weapons that I would use is truth. The weapons that I would use are principles and law. Not law designed by the thief, but international principles of human rights. And so I went back to law school. And after that, I got into the system. I became an attorney, licensed, and have been practicing law and trying to explode the myths of the U.S. system here in Hawaii, challenging the jurisdiction of the United States in Hawaii over our Hawaiian nationals, challenging the right of the Americans to force us to finance our colonization by making us pay taxes to finance their presence here, as well as their presence throughout the world. And so, for me, it makes sense what this Buddhist priest was telling me. The quest is not to walk the straight path, but to learn to walk the crooked path straight. And so it's a lesson not only for me, but I would suggest for many other people who are trying to be true to their basic principles. Principle of what we call hono, of being upright, of being righteous, of being maoli, of being a civil person, a true person to his principles. And yet having to operate and survive, to be able to get a job, to be able to support your children, to be able to educate your people, all of those things. So how do you meander through this oftentimes apparently conflicting system? And so that lesson is something at least to give you comfort, to think about it. There's no singular or all true solutions. But it's that idea of learning to walk the crooked path straight. Be as straight as you can possibly be. At times, such as for me, you come to a point where there's no further negotiating. And that was when Sam King said, "Why haven't you filed a jury selection form in the federal court?" And I respond by saying that I'm not required to. The jury selection form is for U.S. citizens. And he was adamant that I am, and I was just as adamant that I'm not. He threatened to take my license away. And I had just gotten it. I don't want to lose the license. But at that point, I'm not going to negotiate. And I said, if that's the case, then take the darn thing. To make a long story short, I am still licensed in all of the courts in Hawaii. And that has been over 30 years ago in which I got into this conflict with a judge. So I pass that information to you and have you decide how you're going to use this lesson of learning to walk the crooked path straight. And I've worked with many different people, whether they're from the underworld or whether they are police enforcers, policemen, law enforcers. They understand what the truth is. They are not happy with having to walk that crooked path. But at least to the extent that they can meander through it, they are trying to walk the crooked path straight. And that's all we can do. We cannot ask one another to follow somebody else or to follow me. I cannot ask you to follow in my steps because I come from a particular history, from a particular knowledge base, a particular profession. And so I can meander through the stages better than someone else who do not have the same circumstance as I. Nor can I meander through somebody else's circumstance because they know what their own conditions are. So I'm saying, let's not stand in judgment of one another, but let's be understanding and try to have aloha for each other, although they see things differently from us. So that's part of the first singular principle. Okay? The first one was a principle of Wu Chi. The second one was a principle of learning to walk the crooked path straight. Now let me take a look at my notes. I think I've covered those two principles. Number one, over a period of time, I'm going to cover all 5 principles. We may not have time in this taping, but stay tuned for other programs and I will cover all of these principles. The second principle is this 2-dot theory. Okay? Now remember, this is coming from the halal or Poka, and this is on social analysis. What I have learned from a kid growing up in Laenui, where we are recording this, and the things that I have come through as I've learned or experienced these various things. So this idea of 2 dots, imagine, if you will, 2 dots on an endless sheet of paper. Okay? Very simple. We've often been trained to see 2 dots on an endless sheet of paper. And so I'm going to just demonstrate very easily. Here's dot number 1, dot number 2. And you can draw your dots in whatever position you want. The question automatically comes to us who have been trained mathematically or geometrically or in Western scientific cultures. The answer is very clear without even asking the question. The answer is a straight line from dot to dot. That's the best way to connect 2 dots. On an endless sheet of paper, a straight line just continues on, and that's the most effective, most efficient, fastest way to connect 2 dots. Okay, so it seems that we all agree to that principle. But then we have a man from Asia who passes by our 2 dots, and he looks at the 2 dots and he says, I don't feel comfortable with that. You know, there's a belief that we have that everything eventually returns to its point of beginning. If everything returns eventually to its point of beginning, a straight line, in order to return, will have to stop, change direction, and then come back to its point of beginning. That's not efficient. That's not effective. That's a waste of energy. Straight line isn't the right answer. The right answer is a curved line, because it can come right back and connect itself up. I know I'm a bad drawer, so please put up with me. A curved line is far more effective, far more efficient. And you will notice that in, let's say, the Chinese or the Japanese automobiles. They're not built with straight lines. They're more curved. They're rounded edges. Compact. So that's the right answer. But then a third person, let's say a Polynesian man, either from Hawaii or Tonga or Samoa or wherever, or a Pacific Islander, or many other people, many indigenous people, as they walk by and they look at these 2 dots, and they look at a straight line, and they look at a curved line, then they say, gee, I don't feel comfortable with that. You know, why am I stuck to that piece of paper? By the time I finish my life, I want to go what we call holo holo. I want to go visiting. I want to go as many places as I can. In fact, I want to jump out the window and go visit many other places. I want to smell the flowers. I want to taste the mangoes. I want to do many other things in my life before I finally get back. I may, in the meantime, pass by that second dot, but eventually come back to the first dot. I gave that presentation to United Nations Committee on Human Rights. The question at that time was science, technology, and human rights. And at that time, I was the political representative of the World Council of Indigenous Peoples. So as a spokesperson for that organization, the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, I was to suggest viewpoints on science, technology, and human rights. And for a time I was wondering, what could I instruct on that particular issue? And so I relied back on my practice of Tai Chi. In the soft movements, the curve movements, not straight line movements, and in the patience and the enjoyment of the form. But even then, I had to also rely on my Pacific Island background, the fact that I'm not only Hawaiian, but Chinese, and I'm a mixture of many different things, by race, by experience, by education. So I cannot stick to only one approach. At least I should be aware that there are many, many different approaches in life. So in the issue of science, technology, and human rights, to answer the question, what is the best way to connect two dots? Perhaps the real question should be, is that the right question? Is there a necessarily best way to connect two dots? Is there necessarily a best way to answer any question in life? Or is human rights essentially the right of self-determination? Isn't human rights, the father and mother of all human rights, is a right to self-determination? And so what does that mean? It means that the right to decide how one connects his or her dots is essentially an issue, not of mathematics, not of technology. It's a matter of human rights. So no matter how insistent we are about one's political system or how other people should govern themselves, they should have a democratic system, or they should have a socialist system, or a communist system, or whatever economic system they want to develop, or capitalist system. Isn't it the essence of human rights to give each people the right to determine for themselves? And no aggressor, no occupier, no nation, whether he aggresses through economics or military or political influence, has a right to impose themselves upon another people and violate that human right. Each people must be left to their own decision. Okay? So that's a principle of two dots. Okay? I want to raise another issue of tools. And so I'm going to take this, if you can understand this squiggling. Before I do that, before I remove this, let me say, sometimes you and I go to a meeting and we plan the meeting, or we have an idea of how we're going to approach the meeting. It's very clear in our heads. We have set aside an hour for the meeting. We don't want too much talk. We don't want to meander all over the place. We want to get right to the issue. We are trained. We are educated in a particular way. Getting to the issue, right to the issue. It's like the 2 dots, straight line. But when we get to the meeting, what happens? Somebody wants to introduce a different approach, and they go, what we call lalao. They go all over the place. Especially the kupuna, who starts talking about, well, you have to understand that the history of this place is that there's a particular current that comes in, maybe every 10 years, every 5 years, sometimes even longer. And you put that building on the sand here because you want your, your lifeguard to establish himself there. You better watch out because the current going to come and go move them. This actually happened. So she explains all of these other things that you need to consider. The engineer says to Kavena Pukui at Macau Beach when she was still alive, which puts us perhaps 30 to 40 years ago, and she tells me directly this story. And so the engineer says, oh yeah? Where's your authority for this conclusion? We have researched it. We looked all over the place. And what you say does not exist. That's not how the currents operate. Where's your authority? So Tutu Kavena says, I am the authority. The engineer doesn't believe him. Puts up the guard shack, and lo and behold, it gets wiped out. So sometimes being patient and allowing other people to have different views of the subject matter. You might think, oh, there she goes again, or there he goes again. These kupunas are taking up so much time, and then we're going to have to come back again, and we never make a conclusion. But when the conclusion is made, you have heard from everybody. You have given everybody an opportunity to chime in, to give their experience. So it's not only you, not only me, although sometimes even I get frustrated. Patience is very important. Okay, so that's the lesson with regards to the 2 dots, but there's something else about the tools that I want to talk about. And this is, to one extent, so obvious, and yet we don't pay enough attention to it. I'm going to move on this side, because if I take this sheet down, oh, I know what I can do. I can put up a sheet on that side later on. But if I take this sheet down, then underneath is all dirty, and I don't want to expose my dirty sheet. All right, so let's move on this side. There's something else that is happening in the community, in the society, here in Hawaii and all over the world. Sometimes we don't fully appreciate it. And sometimes I use terms that people's eyes begin to wander or to float backwards. They say, oh, here he goes again, talking about things I just don't understand. But I think I can break it down so that you can understand this idea of a deep culture. Cultures which go very deep inside of us. What are these deep cultures? Well, first let's talk about what is culture. And we all like to think that, oh, we understand culture. Of course we understand culture. We understand Chinese culture, Japanese culture, Haole culture, Filipino culture, Portuguese culture, Hawaiian culture, culture all over the place. You express your culture by the clothes you wear, whether or not you wear a lei. You express your culture by the food you eat. So there is this first level of culture. It's called the outer layers of culture. Level number 1, just the outer layers. So you have a person just arrived on United Airlines, came from Wisconsin, but he's wearing an aloha shirt. And as he steps off the plane, he sees the lei sellers or the greeters. And he says, aloha, I'm so happy to be in Hawaii. I feel like I'm Hawaiian. So what do? I know the attitude, the hand motion like that. Who the heck does this guy think he is? Just because he knows the word, just because he wears a aloha shirt, just because he wears a lei, he thinks he's Hawaiian. But that's level number 1 culture. You have level number 2 culture, which is not only the outer appearance, but perhaps an attempt to practice, maybe learning the language, or taking a class in hula, or going to the bond dance and actually dancing and learning the language of the culture you want to identify with, eating the food. That may take you down to the second level of culture. So when we talk about culture and whether or not the person is of this or that culture, what level are we talking about? Then there's a third level. A person who incorporates a culture and sort of lives the culture in his home. Has, let's say, a Buddhist symbol of Buddha, or a Christian symbol, or the cross of David, or it filters into the religious aspect, or many different ways of expressing the culture, and you bring it home and you practice it, or you have grown up in that culture. But in your other life, you still go out and you work like a haole, or work like a Japanese if you're in the tourist industry, catering to Japanese, or Chinese, or the rest. That's the third level of culture. But there's another culture that I call the deep culture. Okay? The deep culture goes into your inner sense of how the world is created and how you respond to the world. This will seem like I'm jumping the subject. I'm not really. I want to explain deep culture in this particular way. At the bottom of our society, and I'm sorry, I'm not a good drawer. At the bottom of our society, what do we have? We have our environment. Okay, we have the trees, we have the resources, we have the ocean. We have our total environment that forms the foundation of our life. Sometimes we don't appreciate it, but we spoil our environment and eventually reaches us and it spoils us. But now we're coming to perhaps an understanding, but not moving to actually taking action. But this is the foundation of societies. And then the environment will represent to a lot of people what we call resources. Resources, and when you look at resources, people operate with resources in different ways. A capitalist comes in. A capitalist who follows, let's say, Adam Smith. And he looks at resources, or she, looks at resources as an opportunity to maximize profit, an opportunity to increase one's gain so that you can, let's say, control the market. Okay? So that's one approach. So when you look at resources, whose is it? And how can I get it? So when, who was that? Columbus arrives in Americas. He sees that, there's some resources that these Indian folks are having, and they don't fully appreciate the value of it. They're wearing gold as mere trinkets. And so he begins to use a resource, gathering as much gold as he can. I won't go into the whole story of gold collection. But that's an attitude that some people take, looking at resources and asking yourself, how can I maximize the profit out of the resources? Other people take a different attitude. They look at the environment. Let's take the Hawaiian approach. They look at the environment and they say the resources are a gift. It's a gift not to me, but with that gift comes an obligation to me to try to maintain these resources to the generations that are to come. What we call the mo'omo'o, or the pula-pula, the shoots, the young shoots, or the mo'omo'o. Let me explain this idea of mo'o and mo'omo'o. A mo'o is a lizard. And I'm happy to say I don't have any crawling on the wall now. But a mo'o is a lizard. A mo'omo'o is a figurative way, a counter way of expressing the generations into the future, unnumbered. When you look at the fetus, at the baby in the mother's womb, and you can see how the baby is curled in a particular way that it looks like a mo'o. The mo'omo'o is the fetus within that fetus. It's a baby within a baby. It's a generation within that generation. And of course, now having repeated it, it's a generation unnumbered. So it's the continuing future. So as we look at our resources from a more traditional Hawaiian approach, the obligation is not to increase the profit that you can make from that resource, but to always preserve the resource so that the generations in the future will always have the opportunity to enjoy these resources. Okay. So you have different people with different ways of looking at different things. In this case, I've tried to explain resources. But what happens is that the society then builds a system above your resources. And on that system, they build an economic theory, they build social theories, they build political theories. They talk about how these resources are to be used, how you own it, how you can trade it with a piece of paper called a deed or a lease, or how you can create paper money for the purpose of managing your resources. So they build a system on top of that called the economic, social, political system. And on top of that, what they do is they build another system, and that's called politics, or political system of how things are to operate and who's going to govern and who's going to decide on the distribution and the control of the resources. And finally, what they do is they build on top of all of that a military system. They call it a security system, to secure your political system. Your political system that represents your economic, social systems, your education system included. So let me add education here. Sorry for the scratchiness of the writing. My producer will make it clearer in a separate display. Okay. So they're all protecting. So this is a military or security system that protects the political system, that protects this third level, that is all to protect your resources. How or what is the approach that is taken to control these resources? Different societies have different ways of doing it. You take one society, let's take the American society at the present time. What are the principles upon which they had built this system? It is all based on the deep culture that they have. You remember earlier I was talking about how do you look at resources? Well, if you look at resources as the right to control, the right to dominate, so you have that D, domination. Okay? The right to dominate, to make rules, to control these resources. The second principle that they base this whole system that they had built upon is based on individualism. What does that mean? That means ownership. If it's mine, it's mine. It's not yours, it's mine. Okay? We clear about that? It's not ours. It's not us guys. It's not for the team. It's not for the community. It's not for the nation. If I own it, if I own that hotel, it's mine. Individualism. They translate it even to their religion. Very individualized religious practices. In politics or in law, they have your basic constitutional principles. The principle of free speech. Who has the right of free speech? That individual. Never mind about the community. If that individual has a right of free speech, let him free speech as much as he wants. So you have a 16-year-old youth who discovered, it's part of the family secret, that dad has had an association, some people call it an affair, with another woman, not his wife. The other woman who lives maybe across the block, who also has a family. But this young man, having this discovery, decides that, oh, I also found out that I have the right of free speech. So he goes out to the corner and he starts talking about and telling everyone, in fact getting a megaphone and talking about the affair that his father is having with another woman. And he's basing it on his right of free speech. What happened to the principle of hila hila? Or the idea of knowing shame? What's the matter with you? Don't you have common sense? So there you have a conflict. Some people are saying, well, you got to think of the family, you got to think of the hurt that you're creating all over the place because of your big mouth. And yet the youth says, but I have the right, I have the constitutional right. They focus in on the individual rights. That's part of the deep culture. Another focus is, again, looking at law. Everyone has a right of a fair trial. But who do they bring to court? The individual. So a guy driving down the street had a few drinks, gets into a car accident, kills the passenger in the other car and the driver. When he is brought, when the criminal charges are brought before the court, what is the court looking at? They're looking at this individual who drove in such a stupid way that he drank before he drove and he killed occupants of the other car, even perhaps occupants of his own car. So you try that individual and then you find him guilty, you send him to jail for a couple of years, and then you say, justice has been done. But what about the greater responsibility, the greater hurt that has occurred in the community? The families between the two people in the two separate cars, the relationship between the families. What about the advertisers who keep pumping up that enjoy life, have a beer, have two, have as many as you want, put it all in a cooler and have a good time? Who addresses the responsibilities of the corporation? Who addresses the responsibility of the shop that sold the individual those things? You say, well, they can be sued separately, but who has the money to sue them separately? So what we have in the society is a very directed, individualized aspect of this deep culture that we are governed by. So we have, on one hand, domination, on the other hand, individualism, and on the third foundation of this deep culture is the E, which I call exclusion. Okay. Have I been standing in front of the diagram so I cannot see? So we have domination, individualism, and exclusion. Either you're with us or you're against us. There's no in between. Who's the famous guy who said, either you're with us or you're against us? George Bush, when he wanted to attack Iraq, blaming Iraq for the 9/11 events in the United States. There was no proof of it. It was more Osama bin Laden. There was at least a little bit more proof with regards to Osama bin Laden, who actually comes from Saudi Arabia. And it was Saudi Arabian citizens who appears to have participated in this attack. Osama bin Laden was staying in, Afghanistan at that time. But George Bush says there's no in between. Either you're with us or you're against us. This idea of exclusion. The U.S. system, the formal system, is governed by this deep culture called domination, individualism, and exclusion. D-I-E. What is the alternative? Where else can we look? What about Hawaii? Hawaii's formal system, our educational system, our economic system, our environmental system, our judicial system, the formal systems of Hawaii, our political system, is all based on domination, individualism, and exclusion. People are not satisfied. And yet, there's an undergrowth that is occurring, where people are saying there has to be something else, and there is something else. What is that something else? In the local system, generally we attribute it to the Hawaiian system. But in the local system, for us guys who grew up in Hawaii, whether you're Haole, Hawaiian, Filipino, Japanese, or whatever it is, the local style has been, instead of domination, there's a word we call olu-olu. Okay, olu-olu, O-L-U, O-L-U, olu-olu. That means to be comfortable with, to be non-confrontational, to be easygoing, to be able to work around things where we find objectionable. We can still disagree, but that doesn't mean that we are mortal enemies. We can still cooperate. If I'm operating a shop, let's say I open an attorney's shop here in Laenui, and there's another attorney from the other side, and I note that he's having a hard time. What do I say? Too bad for the guy. No. From this olu-olu style, I call him up and say, hey brother, you need some help. Or I get some extra clients, maybe you can pick up some clients, or whatever it is, olu-olu. And that's the way business, in at least the older style, used to be conducted. Instead of domination, I'm going to conquer the market. I'm going to take over the market. Just in the economic language, you see this domination. Okay? So this is olu-olu. That's a local style. Instead of individualism, there's another word that we have, and it's called lokahi. What does lokahi mean? It means a group. It means us guys. It means all of us. It means kako. Later on, I'm going to share with you, if I have time, a poem called kako. And it means kako. It's not to individualize it, but to recognize that we all need to share with one another. Okay. And then finally, instead of exclusion, we have the word, and if you can see it, it's A for aloha. even people we don't know. We don't call them gooks or chinks or wetbacks or anything like that. We call them neighbors. We try to incorporate people with a sense of aloha. That's a different deep culture. It's a informal deep culture that also runs a part of the society. So on one hand, you have the DIE culture, and on the other hand, you have the OLA culture, the OLA culture. These are very different cultures, and yet they still supposedly exist within our current system. So as we look at societies, on one hand, some societies practice and elevate the DIE, deep culture. And the other side is trying to assert a softer, kinder culture. You can see it even in American politics today. On one hand, you have the GOP, the so-called grand old party, that is remaking itself more and more and more into a DIE culture. Domination, individualism, exclusion. And yet, on the other side, you have people talking about, well, let's take a different attitude about these people who are walking 1,000 miles to see if they can find new opportunities in our border towns or in the United States. Can something be done looking at it from a base of humanity rather than exclusion? Okay? So there's a big struggle now going on, but what is happening is that people do not yet have the language of understanding deep cultures. So the consideration, the transaction is not being discussed at that level. Not only in the United States, but even here in Hawaii, that is a continuing issue of contention. How should we be treating the environment? Do we take the environment as a sacred trust given to the people? Even in private property, you cannot just destroy private property. You got to maintain it appropriately, share it when appropriate. And so we are seeing this thing swing towards an Ola deep culture rather than a Dai deep culture. The question of Hawaiian sovereignty is really a question of how do we remake our society to reflect more appropriately the sacredness of this society. What should be the deep culture? How do we have that revolution, and what do we revolt against or toward? Those are all issues that we have to give consideration in this particular social analysis of our society. I want to thank you all for joining me, giving me the opportunity to share some of my approaches. There are many other approaches that I do want to talk about, and we'll save that to some other time. I am Poka Laenui, and in the future I plan to be broadcasting on my radio station. You will have more information about it on the screen that will be coming out. And so with that, I say aloha, ahui ho. Thank you for joining.